vote yes or no based on Alex Salmond more than anything else. Our thoughts around Labour are the SNP, and there's a lot of obviously it seems that the idea of more devolution is something judging by these polls. And I think that's even the polls in the run up to the deciding of the question did show that there was quite an appetite for having some sort of discussion about further powers, and because that discussion, that kind of topic is not on the table, and I think it's a topic that a lot of people would like to see on the table. We've ended up with this increasingly kind of defensive bunker mentality from two groups kind of trying to take lumps out of each other whenever they get a chance. And it just feels, I know it's become a bit of a cliche, people aren't engaged, people aren't involved, and it's a long time to go. But I do worry about it. I do worry about the division that it causes, especially like the online, it's becoming increasingly poisonous forum, I feel. And things are getting pulled out and spun by both sides. But particularly the no side, it has to be said. And I think I actually find it quite dispiriting, and I think it is making people not want to engage.
What do you think, Michael? I mean, I don't know what I think about oppositional politics. I think is fine. I always say, I'm in favour of consensus insofar as the consensus is a good one. And, you can see the example of what I would describe as a bad consensus in terms of Westminster politics and its commitment to markets and things like that in terms of things I'd rather see in public ownership. That's a bad consensus from my point of view, disguised by kind of lots of hot air and finger pointing. What do you think? Do you worry, like Peter, that the division may linger and cause sort of wounds which don't heal properly?
I think, unfortunately, it's something of a likelihood at the moment that there will be some relationships soured. But last week's guest, Jamie Maxwell, had an article about this. And I know we're talking about not pointing fingers, but the majority of the negativity is coming from one side. I mean, they named it themselves as Project Fear. I mean, for example, Andrew, You've said a few times that you don't like bitter together as a term because it's grouping all these people together, and I'd agree with you completely on that. But when themselves they're calling it Project Fear, you have to wonder from where is a lot of this negativity coming. However, there is a tendency on the yes side to sort of jump on someone and have a go very quickly, although some people may deserve it from time to time.
One thing, I mean, this thing that I watched after listening to your podcast last week with Carolyn and Jamie to that Russia Today or Tonight or whatever it's called interview with Alex Salmond, and in that he said something which really, really pissed me off, which was he said he was talking about committed unionists and then said if such a creature even exists. You think, what a really stupid thing to say. And I think that touches on a sort of a strain of argument, an argumentative strategy, which you get actually from quite a lot of people, which is that the only reason why people don't favour independence is because they have the sort of scales in their eyes. And once the scales fall from their eyes and they are suitably informed, they'll be transformed from opposing independence into a supporter of it. And that's such a patronising form of argument that I see clearly while all around me are benighted. The idea that there is no positive case for the union, that's all abject nonsense as far as I'm concerned. And I believe quite profoundly in Scottish independence. But I think there's that framing of advocacy and underlying it, the idea underlying it that the only difference between a yes supporter and a no supporter is brains, independence of mind, and a bit of wit is frankly outrageous and is going to convince absolutely no one. And I was quite dispirited to see Salmond, who's usually a little cannier and sharper on his feet than that, to say something like that. You think, of course there are committed unionists for a whole range of different reasons, which I might not share as important political principles. I wouldn't share the kind of historical, traditional argument from Tories, whatever, as a good reason, a convincing reason for supporting union. But for them, that's their politics, and that's something which one can respect, I think.
But if there is a positive case for the union, which there may well be, then the Better Together group haven't made it. That's not been their tactic to promote a positive case for the union.
No, I think that's true. But like I was saying right at the head of the programme, I think we maybe can ask interesting questions about, well, what is contemporary unionism? What does it look like? What is its contents and what is its politics? And I think you do see a kind of diminishing sense about union and co-equal nations coming together.
I would agree. I think there's, I think you're right. There's a kind of there's an assumption that there's a false consciousness, a kind of an almost Marxist false consciousness amongst those who do not support independence. And I think independence supporters do tend to assert that position, that somehow you've not reached your full understanding of the innateness of Scotland, not as a country, but as a nation state that should have its own structures and government, which is actually quite a different discussion than the idea of Scotland as a country, as an actual kind of separate country, but not necessarily a separate nation state. I think probably that the issue around unionism is how does it find some sort of positive political message to send if it's in this state of kind of intellectual disarray. But I think that's been the hallmark of so far, has been the kind of intellectual lacuna in the entire debate. The SNP, the S campaign, if you want to call them different, have been slightly better, but there has been a marked lack of ideas kind of floating around. It's almost the same, things will be the same but different, or the same but the same, regardless of what you're voting for. And I do worry that some of that is to do with the fact that ideas are not really allowed to be aired without being attached to people. And the people, too often the man is played, not the ball. In debates, they become X's idea or Y's idea. It becomes very much a debate around people. And I think that's really stopping some people who might have actually interesting, engaging ways to get involved with it. Like, for example, yesterday I went for a drink with a friend of mine who's in a big third sector organisation. He was saying the amount of people he meets who would really like to get engaged with the debate, would really like to come out and talk about it, who've got interesting ideas. But they're worried. Because what will happen, they're worried about the reception they'll get immediately, but they're also worried about the reception 12 months down the line after a potential vote. And that does create, climate of fear has probably been a bit, I don't want to overdo it, but it does have a kind of a chilling effect on debate. And I think that is something that does need some sort of, I don't know, is it to do with the wider move in politics more generally, where there is a personality? There's been Scotland is not immune from the wider political changes we've seen across the country in terms of attitudes towards most things. It has slightly more in terms of social attitudes, slightly different, and slightly more pro-European and things like that. But in general, they're not huge. And also, we've seen the same reduction in turnout. We see the same dissatisfaction with politicians, whether they're in Holyrood or if they're in Westminster. And I think that, and by the same token, we've also seen a certain personalisation of politics, celebrity politics. And what goes with that, I think, is a kind of a wariness of ideas and a much more of an emphasis on people. And I think that's what we're seeing in the campaign. I think that's probably, it's not a great, it doesn't make for a great forum for debate, especially when you've got such a long run up to a vote.
Well, doesn't that go back to Blair in Britain in particular? I mean, it was even there before, but Blair sort of began to make that much more of an issue here. Although I still remember cringing at Neil Kinnock coming into a party conference with an American accent saying, "Well, all right." And you're like, Jesus Christ. But no, I think that's something, that kind of cult of personality. It's something that's been imported from America in some ways. But Blair, love him or loathe him, and I certainly loathe him, was the master of that here.
Oh, sorry. I just think, especially since I've moved to Glasgow, I've noticed in some ways it doesn't help the S campaign because of that assumption that it is Alex Salmond. The amount of people I meet, especially in Glasgow, like, I'm not going to vote for independence because I hate Alex Salmond. And I think that is a big issue because of, and it can't, even independent. If you read that column or that feature in the New Statesman a few months ago, the interview with Alex Salmond, where independence and Alex Salmond, and even an interview with Russia Today, independence and Alex Salmond become so bound up with one another that I think that's, again, is quite it all becomes back down to some sort of assumption around personalities in politics. And obviously, there is the great men of history, or maybe there isn't, but I think if everything gets reduced down to that, it's very hard to actually have discussion about ideas.
Different ideas. Yeah, I mean, one thing that I think is interesting, and which I've certainly noticed, is that one of the sort of articulations we've got, which I think is an idea actually, rather than a be about people, in terms of the particularly Labour Party argument for continuing union, is British nationalism, and I think that's actually really very interesting. I mean, it's a point I've made several times, but there's a useful concept that I don't know if it was coined, but certainly is used by a historian of unionism, Colin Kidd, where he talks about instrumental unionism. nationalism being at the heart of much of Labour's historical rhetoric around union. So it's sort of it's union to deliver particular forms of social justice, workers' rights, to challenge the power of capital concentrated in London. Those kind of historical sort of arguments. And I think we're hearing less and less of those arguments, and we're hearing instead fundamentally rather sentimental, identity-driven ideas about why Britain should be stuck with. And I think that's actually rather, given the kind of the internationalism rhetoric that you often get from members of the Labour Party and sort of explicit hostility towards nationalism, it's rather interesting to see Ed Miliband, but I think across all levels of Labour politics, this really strong focus on sort of one nation Britain, and I don't know what either of you think about it, the emergence of that or the use of that here.
I think it backfires tremendously. I don't think anyone's particularly interested in that idea in Scotland. Very, very few.
Peter?
I guess it does trace back to that increasing divergence. That recent research by Charlie Jeffrey in Edinburgh University and was it Wyn Grant in Cardiff about Englishness and the rise of Englishness. And I think we are seeing an increasing splintering in terms of identity and along ideas around being Scottish, Welsh, English, even Northern Irish from the last census, which is particularly interesting in that context. And I'm not quite sure. The British nationalism, it feels like an attempt to a glued-on concept on top of a strategy. I don't know. I don't meet very many people that explicitly seem to kind of cleave to this idea of Britishness.
Because that's what I wonder about the sort of the perils. We were talking earlier about polarization, and one aspect of polarization is that you spend your time talking to people who agree with you, and you get into a kind of echo chamber where the things which matter to you assume generalize to the population at large. And one thing that interests me is the question, I suppose, about, well, is British nationalism in the context of Scotland and British identities, does that have enough juice, if you like, for Better Together as a positive argument for the Union, assuming that the negative ones in and of themselves aren't sufficient to grind nationalism into the dirt, and they may well be. I'm not sure about that. Certainly there is some interesting polling if you look at what are called Moreno scales of identity, which are the ones which assume that a population has two, and I've mentioned them before, I think, on here. And if you look at them, then you find that actually people who think they're equally Scottish and British, that's the turning point. That's when opposition to independence becomes much more significant than those who are primarily Scottish, but also think of themselves as being British in some way as well.
Just to move it on a little bit there, another interesting thing in the poll is if you add some of the numbers together, you'll find something very interesting. The huge gap that we're constantly told that there is between the yes and the no simply didn't come up in this poll. If you add in the different kinds of yes that was in question 7 of the poll and the different kinds of no, you get 36% no, 34% yes, and 30% don't know, which I think is considerably different numbers from the usual polling we hear. Did you notice that one, Andrew? What do you think of that?
I didn't, though. I had an interesting conversation recently online with somebody who is a kind of on the ground Yes Scotland supporter, and it was from the recent actual Panelbase poll, not the one that Wing Scotland commissioned, but the one before that, which is about the gender gap. And the gender gap was, as is becoming traditional, quite terrifying.
It still is in this one as well.
Yeah, is it? Okay. But certainly I was remarking on that, and he was saying that the polls don't meet their canvas returns. Now, what one wants to make of that, you may think that they've been hoodwinked by relatively smaller samples of people, and that overall the polls might be more on the nose. So I want to be cautious. I mean, I'm moving back to Glasgow imminently, so I want to be cautious about making guesses about the populace, because I don't live in Scotland at the moment, but I will do shortly, so I'll get back to you in a month or so and let you know whether that seems to be more on the nose about whether people are more undecided than the polls generally.
Can I just to lighten the tone a bit, I'll finish off with this poll with one thing. 4% of people can't remember who they voted for in the last election. I can't imagine forgetting who I had voted for.
It's probably they're probably lying. They probably didn't vote, but they didn't want to own up to not having voted. That's probably what it was.
I suppose that would move us on to another thing: is that only 6% of people agree with Michael Kelly in that the Scottish Parliament should have no powers in the future. In the result of a no vote. What do you think of Michael Kelly's recent statements, Peter?
I think Andrew touched on my kind of my growing kind of gloom about the state of the commentariat, or well, like some of the state of discussion anyway about the issue of Scottish independence. I think it's been a bad week. I think